When I first started being creative, my initial choice was music. I just loved music, man. I loved the sonic textures, the lyrics, and the general songwriting and how everything fit together. But there was one little problem with how much I loved music. I wasn't very good at it. I kind of sucked, you know what I mean? But this didn't matter because I was just at the beginning of my musical journey. I had plenty of time to learn, plenty of time to become the musician I wanted to become. Looking back, this is a normal and healthy thought. Now, I know it's a bit of a meme to quote Stoic philosophers in a YouTube video, but the great Stoic philosopher Jake the Dog once said,
"Dude, sucking at something is the first step towards being sorta good at something."
But even with that Jake the Dog quote, I still had one other problem. And that was, even as I grew as a person, my music did not. I got older and my music kept sucking. There was just this hurdle that I couldn't get past, and I don't even know what it was, man. It was like, the songs on the radio just didn't sound like the songs that I was making, and the results showed. Nobody listened to it, and if anybody did, it was just met with cringe. In fact, let's meet it with cringe right now. I've actually got a sample of my music on my phone.
I wanna die before my family, I want to die before my friends. I wanna die years and years before I ever make amends, and if I...
Oh God, I'm so sorry. So I did what any rational person would do. I decided to cut my losses, quit music, go get a job, and just get on with my life. That's what I did. I recorded one last EP and just split. Now let's compare that story with the story of me drawing comics, which came a few years later in my life. When I first started drawing comics, they sucked. Like, they really sucked. But that's okay because...
sucking at something is the first step towards being sorta good at something.
We get the point, we get the point. It's just what the start of a journey looks like. But a year in, my comics were kind of, they weren't sucking as much, man. They actually started getting, I don't know, a little bit okay. Strangers, real life strangers started liking my work, which was a very new thing for me. Not many, I will say that, but you know, people who didn't have to be nice to me were being nice to me, and that was a really cool sign. 2 years in, my comics started getting reposted in all sorts of places that I never thought I'd see them. 3 years in, and these comics had amassed like a bit of a following. It was crazy, man. 4 years in, and these comics started making me more money than my old job did. And 5 years in, which is almost where I'm at now, I think I've sort of pivoted away from comics, but the point is that it is a very different story to the 5 years that I spent making music. When I look at these two stories side by side, I have three big questions. The first, what was the difference between music and comics? The second, how do you know when to persist with something past the point of sucking? When do you quit and when do you stick it out? And the third, what lessons can we learn from all of this and how can we apply them to our lives? These are the three questions that I'm going to attempt to answer in this video. And as always, just a quick little disclaimer. I am in no way trying to call myself successful. This isn't like I've made it or any of that sort of stuff. I'm a huge work in progress. I'm still years off being great. And all the stuff that I talk about in this video really applies more to people who are trying to turn their stuff into a career. This isn't about hobbies or the immediate pleasure that you get from a craft. This is about pursuing it for career's sake. Alrighty, let's do it. What was the difference between music and comics? There are a few. I think because I've been playing guitar since I was like 14, there was a little bit of my identity that was wrapped up in being a musician, and so I think it was a bit more precious to me, whereas comics I didn't care about as much, which is strange. But I think by pursuing something that meant less to me and was less wrapped up in my identity, it allowed me to experiment more, and it meant that I knew less about the industry, which meant that I had kind of approached it with a bit of naive optimism, and I was comfortable if I failed. So that was cool. I also felt less arrogant, which might have just been because I aged or because I had learned the lessons of failure, but I wonder if it was because I thought that I knew more about music than I did about drawing. Like, I couldn't draw when I started drawing. I still can't really draw, but yeah. And on that note, the main lesson that I think that I had learned is to move in an actual direction, not just to hit and hope, not just to make songs and hope that one day someone will go, this kid's got it, here's $1 million, you know? That sort of lesson. So having it chronologically come second once I had got all the experience was a huge benefit. One that I couldn't control, the timing was better with social media. When I was making music, it was like 2011, 12, and when I was drawing, it was maybe 2016, 2017, 2018. So there was just a bit more maturity to the internet at that point. And finally, I think I had a much bigger incentive, and that was I'd worked a job I hated. So by having a big reason, I think it gave me desperation because I'm like, oh God, the contingency if this doesn't work is hell. So the second question, how do you know if something is worth persisting past the point of sucking? This comes from the very natural observation that a lot of us can make, and that is we do not have an unlimited amount of time, so we have to pick and choose the things that we want to do. I've heard online people talk about the 3-year rule. So do something for 3 years before you decide whether or not you should pursue it. And that gives you enough time to get past the point where you suck, past all the teething issues and the initial hurdles, into the point where you're like, all right, if this has some positive signs, I'll keep going. If it doesn't, I'll cut my losses and try the next thing. So the immediate follow-up question is, what are some signs that you can look for in the first 3 years to know whether something is worth pursuing? For me, it's like getting big deals in the works. If you're a musician, it might be getting a record deal, or if you're an author, getting a book deal, that sort of thing. It's getting followers. I think followers are a great sign now in today's social media internet world. Third one is it just makes you feel good. Don't let me stop you. I think a big one for me that I've always noticed is when people don't have to be nice to you about that craft, but they are. That's a big one for me. And finally, the fifth sign that I look for is it gets picked up by something. So maybe it gets picked up by like an outlet or by like a network or by a YouTube algorithm. I don't know. Something along those lines. I think it was fellow bald man Seth Godin who said that when something's in the idea phase, it can be tested by using the reaction of the first 10 people that you tell it to. So like, let's say 7 out of 10 of those people are like, dude, you have to make that. Because that's how people talk. Then you probably have to make that. But if only 2 people are like, you have to make that, and the other 8 are like, yeah, you do you, man. You do you. You and your ideas. Then maybe it's time to tweak the approach. Market viability is sadly so important. Finally, a huge indicator for me is there a viable path to what you define as success with no gatekeepers? I think when I was making music, I needed a gatekeeper like a radio station to say, yes, we'll play this, or a record label to say, yes, we'll push this. But when it came to comics, I could just make them, push them out, make them, push them out, make them and push them out. So without gatekeepers, I could still kind of control what was going on. And I think that's super important. I also think that we live in a time with much fewer. So that's pretty cool. The final thing that I'm going to mention about this question, whether or not to persist with an idea, is the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the idea that you owe a project something just because you've given it a lot of time. For me, it was, oh man, I've been in this band for like 3 years. Surely at this point we have to make an album. But the thing that I was missing is my band, we sucked. We weren't very good. Yeah, man. Yeah. And when I heard about the sunk cost fallacy, I realized that I was falling victim to it. I realized that I thought that I owed all the time that I had spent the album, or I thought that I owed it more time, when in reality I could have used that time for something better. I could have switched tactics, changed lanes, and tried something else. Because, was it Einstein? I don't even know, but what's that quote? Insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Yeah, I was a little bit insane. Just a little bit. Anyway, the point here is to test all your thinking against these cognitive biases, because sometimes when we recognize that they're there, it helps us get out of that rut. All right, let's talk about the third question in our list. What are some of the lessons that we can take here and apply to our lives? I've kind of put it down to 6 lessons and I've put them in order. This is just what's worked for me, but this is kind of the system that I think I use. So let's go through them. 1, start with the obvious truth. You are gonna suck. It's just gonna happen. You know what I'm saying? Being bad isn't in the way, it is the way. It's the opposite of what I said about perfectionism. There's that tweet. You've probably seen this one. Yeah, here we are. Your first podcast will be awful. Your first video will be awful. Your first article will be awful. Your first art will be awful. Your first photo will be awful. Your first game will be awful. But you can't make your 50th without making your first. So get it over with and make it. Son, give them hell. How freaking inspiring. It is inspiring, actually. I do like that. I subscribe to that. So that's step 1. Step 2, you wanna make sure that as you learn, you experiment. I think that experimentation is positive because it gets you to new highs and it shows you stuff that you might not have seen before, but it's only possible when you mitigate any kind of feeling of desperation. So if you're anything like me making music, I think I was so desperate to succeed. I almost needed it to fulfill something within my identity, but with comics I didn't, and having that level of freedom allowed me to explore a little more. Step 3, create in a system where there are fewer gatekeepers. This might be social media because you're appealing to the market, or it might not be, I don't know. But basically you want to structure your work so it's not hinging on the yes of one person. You're not waiting for all your dreams to come true just because you get a green light here. There is something you can do in the meantime. Step 4, look for signs that you won't suck forever. These could be getting true positive feedback. You can see a viable path where you don't need the yes of a gatekeeper. You can tangibly see and measure your improvement. And if you do want it as a career, you can see some financial sustainability in it. Step 5, create a concrete definition of success. I think once you are going, it helps so much to know where you're going. I think when I wanted to be a musician, I just had this vague idea of what that meant. I'm just like, I just want to be a musician, man. Playing a band and stuff. But there was no concrete idea of what success looked like, so there wasn't like a direction that I could head. Whereas when I started drawing comics, I think that I had this idea, and it was petty, but at least it was concrete. I'm like, it would be cool to get 10,000 followers. And then I did that, and I was like, oh, man, that was cool. And now I've got equally petty ones, like, oh, I want 1 million YouTube subs or $1 million in the bank, you know, stuff like that, where it's like all ego. But then I've also got some actual ones, which is I want messages from people saying that I helped them. And that's now kind of where I'm at. But in any case, I think if you write these down and actually know where you're going, it helps so much. And then finally, step 7, pivot as necessary. Your interests and goals are going to change over time, so just grow with them. You don't have to keep flogging a horse because people liked the horse when they rocked up to your party. God, that's a mixed metaphor. What I'm saying is, if you are making the same thing over and over again, you can iterate on that thing and find new ways to say whatever it is that you want to say. Other than that, have a gorgeous day. Catcha.